I've been working for the past several years on the role of warfare and military operations in general as a major dimension, a very particular disruptive dimension of the ways humans relate to the natural environments, how we use natural resources, how we exploit and extract, and how, in some cases, we leave the natural world alone because of circumstances of warfare and mass conflict. What most of us do in environmental history studies is about peacetime. Wartime is so very different, it's difficult to understand. In an important way, the military historians and military geographers have already done an enormous amount of work, centuries, on the environmental settings of conflict, climate patterns, sudden rainstorms, or the cold snaps that affect what happens in wartime and in conflicts. What they hadn't done very much, it's usually at the edges of their work, is the consequences, the impacts, the environmental aftermath of warfare and of battle areas. If you're watching a war movie, behind that, at the far edges, behind the shoulders and the heads of the people whose dramas we're focused on, lies a natural setting, or possibly an urban setting, because there's an urban history of warfare too. And that's what we're trying to add to the human picture, to the humanities, if you like, not to substitute for it, because the two are inseparable. This year, of course, is the centennial of the beginning of World War I, which was the massive shock to human cultures, human societies, human expectations about what civilization was. What we're trying to do now as environmental historians is to add the dimension of environmental consequences, the costs. And so we are now looking at a range of issues that haven't generally been considered part of the war story. So food production, that's a question of what's happening on and to the land. And then I had begun thinking about caffeine, both the war machines and the fighters and the civilians. By 1914, were very accustomed to caffeine, whether it came from tea or coffee or even chocolate, that are grown and produced in many parts of the world, and yet they were considered to be essential for the war. But we should also notice back into the human sphere, huge numbers of people were displaced. Civilians become part of the war machine. They become victims of the war on a massive scale, massive refugees as a consequence of the two world wars and other situations right up to Syria today, massive numbers of refugees. They all have environmental stress that is associated with the terrible tragedy of their lives. In order to understand the full story, the full consequences of it, we need to take into account, we need to do research on the environmental stress that results from refugee movements. So this is one of the issues that we're coming to work on more and more seriously now. There are times when natural environments prosper because of war. That's the ironic result of civil wars, of some of the insurgencies that we can think of, 30 Years' War in Europe in the 1600s, and there are areas where the human population is severely reduced. All the other living species tend to thrive as a result. During warfare, livestock suffers. Even wildlife suffers because of hunting to provide meat and protein for whoever is trying to survive. And if that hunting stops, then it's good news for the wildlife. And so that's just a reminder to us that in the overall environmental history, the impacts on the natural world and natural resources can go in many different ways. As we're looking more at World War I and also World War II these days, we're finding that the story of the war years is incomplete until we also think about after peace comes back. because humans as well as natural systems recover, they rebuild, and so we have immediate impacts and consequences of the conflict, bombing of the cities and all. And then there's the long-term consequences, which can be very different. The more and more powerful the weapons of destruction become, the more and more difficult it is to recover. One theme in it is the acceleration of the scale of violence, and this is the world we're living in now. Even though the patterns are complex, they're unpredictable, and increasingly widespread through major regions of the world.